In the next couple tutorials, we'll be creating splash screens, a manager to handle multiple scenes, separate code into multiple classes, because only having one would be a huge pain in our Now, as you guys probably have noticed, we've been developing our game just in one class, which will be huge if we continue down this path. So what we're going to do instead is create a scene manager class that's going to be able to transfer between different scenes. It's also going to allow us to load up the splash screen first and then load up all the resources for our entire game. So let's go ahead and create a new class called Scene Manager. And I also want to give props to Stuart in the AndEngine forums for coming up with this way of doing things. It's pretty effective. It might not be the best way of doing things, but it is pretty good. There's a lot of confusion in the AndEngine forums. A lot of people are creating static scenes and transferring that way, which is terrible for memory heap and garbage collection, all the stuff that will eventually crash your game. This is a better way of doing things that I've found. So we're going to use Stuart's scene manager setup here, and I'll kind of explain what's going on. The first thing that we want to do is create a private all scenes, which we'll define what that is in a second. It's going to be enum, but it's going to be our current scene is the variable name. This is what's pretty much displayed to the user. It's the current scene of our game. We'll be able to change this scene later. So let's define what it is, and like I said, it's an enum, which is basically a placeholder. If you get, I don't think I've covered enums in our Java series here at my bringback, but it's just basically a placeholder. So you could say place 1 or 0, place 1, place 2, etc. But instead of using numbers, which is kind of confusing, you can also have names as placeholders. So we're going to have our splash placeholder, which is position 0, our menu, and also our game scene. And those will be our 3 placeholders for now. We might elaborate on that later. But that's our enum. And I'm sorry, this was supposed to be all scenes. That's probably going to confuse some people, so just make sure you add an S to the end of all scenes up here, and that's our enum. The next thing that we want to do is we want to be able to have access to the current scene, since this is a private variable. So we need to give access to the current scene, change it when other classes are using our scene manager. So go ahead and right click. I'm sorry, don't have anything selected, otherwise it might cause you problems. But then right click, go down to source, generate getters and setters, and we're going to create a getter and setter for our current scene variable, and just go ahead and do that. So getting the current scene is pretty self-explanatory. We're just returning this variable, whatever it is, within our enum. Again, we can change which scene is currently selected within our enum or a placeholder. So that's pretty standard, just the getter method. The setter, we're going to have to add some additional stuff to it. It's going to be a switching case, so let's go ahead and do that, and I'll explain what the getter and setter is, or I'm sorry, the setter is in a second. But what we're going to refer to is the variable that's being passed in, which is going to be our current scene or place and our placeholder enum. And so we're going to relate to that. It's not our class variable that we have set up here. If we wanted to refer to that, we'd have to type this.currentScene instead of just current scene, which is being passed in. The next thing that we want to do is create our different cases. So if it's case splash, which is our first case, we aren't really going to do anything with that. The next case will be if it's case menu. We'll relate to our engine of our game, and we are going to change the scene with the set scene method, which we haven't set up our engine to this class yet. So we can create that variable here in a second. But after that, we're just going to break as well. And I'm going to copy this for our game scene, and we'll come back to this in a second. I'm going to move the enum to the top of the class just so we can refer to it later and see things better. Like I said, we need to relate to the engine somehow, so let's create some more variables. I'm probably just going to copy and paste the variables we're going to use within our scene manager class, and you guys can pause the video and catch up. So there they are. We have our base game activity, which will be our game activity here that we set up. Because it extends base game activity. We need a way to pass that into the scene manager class. Also the engine of our game, we need a way to pass that in, and our camera that we're using for a game, we need to pass that in within our constructor. So let's go ahead and go down here and hit Control Space and enter. That's going to set up our default constructor, but again we need these parameters to set up. So we're going to say base game activity. We're going to call this act. We also need our engine, so go ahead and create that variable. Make sure again it's coming from the AndEngine import, and we're going to call that eng, and also camera, and we're going to call this cam, and make sure the camera is being imported from AndEngine as well, not the hardware or the graphics. So go ahead and import that. All our constructor is going to do is set up our class variables. So for example, this dot activity is going to be equal to act. This dot engine is going to be equal to the engine that's being passed in, and this dot cam is going to be equal to the camera passed in. Now we'll be using this method later. Obviously we have to call this constructor of the scene manager within our game activity class, which we'll get into that in the next tutorial. This will probably take 2 tutorials to get through everything, and in the next tutorial I'll do a walkthrough of everything that we set up, because we are setting up quite a bit. So now that we have our engine set up for this class, we can relate to that variable down here within our menu and relate to the engine and just say set scene to our menu scene. And this menu scene is a variable I added here as our different scenes. Again, you probably want to add the import for that from AndEngine, and you can also hit Control-Shift-O to add all imports. So for texture atlas, texture region, go ahead and do that. And for these different scenes, we can create different classes for each scene as well. Again, I'm just kind of doing a basic walkthrough, and again we can elaborate on how we create our scenes later. But just for example, I want to get everyone familiar with the process before we just go into all the hard code. So we have 3 different scenes that we'll set up within different methods here, but all we're relating to within our switching case when we call the set current scene is relating to the engine we're using for our game and setting the scene to the appropriate scene we want to go to, which is our menu scene if our placeholder is on the menu. Again, this might be kind of confusing if you guys are brand new programmers, so make sure you check out the Java series or the Android series, and some of this stuff will become more familiar with you. But we have a lot to cover, so I don't want to get into too much here about what we're doing. Hopefully everything will make sense after we're done with the tutorials, or this tutorial and the next tutorial. You can look over things, digest it, and understand what we are actually doing. But all we're doing is we're changing the current scene according to the placeholder of our enum. So that's pretty much it for the set scene. The next thing that we want the scene manager to do is load up our scenes appropriately. Like I said earlier, if we load all of the resources for our entire game at once before the user sees anything, they might get frustrated, might think our app sucks, and they'll close it, uninstall it. So instead what we want to do is just load the resources for a splash scene, display the splash scene to the user as we're loading the resources for the rest of our game. So let's create some new methods. I'm going to create it right below our constructor, and then we can fill these out. We're going to have 2 void methods, public void load splash resources, and this will just load the resources for a splash scene. And then we also probably want to have another method that loads all of our other resources. Public void load game resources for everything else. Again, we might change this up later, but that should work. The next thing that we want to do after we load the resources is create our actual scenes. And again, we're going to create our splash scene first. So we want it to return a scene variable. We're going to set this equal to create splash scene, and we need to return a scene, but as for now I'm just going to return null. And we also want to copy this maybe and paste it for any other scene that we want to do. I'm just going to relate to the game scene. Whoops. So now we have a way to create our game scene. So these are our 4 new methods that we added to the screen manager. Now we can fill them out appropriately. Within the load splash resource, I threw in a new image that you guys can download if you're on the forums, or I'm sorry, on our website mybringback.com. Following along there, it just looks like this, like I showed in the preview of this tutorial. And again, you need to remember the size of your image so we can create the appropriate texture atlas, which we covered in the last tutorial. This image is 256 pixels by 256 pixels, which is 2 to the power of 8. So it will work for our texture atlas as well, because again, our texture atlas needs to be to the power of 8.